The final talk is Professor Francis Richmond, Professor and Chair, Department of Regulatory and Quality Sciences, also a member of the International Center for Regulatory Science, Director of the Regulatory Science Program, USC School of Pharmacy, University of Southern California. And the title of Francis' talk is The Great Divide, Meeting Need for Regulatory Competence in Academia versus Industry.
Thank you very much. It's late, but so I'm going to try to keep this a little more general. So for the whole of the day and through all the poster sessions, I sense that we all share a common vision. Now, not all of you work on nanoparticles or nanotechnology, but I think for any of the technologies that we've discussed, this kind of standard picture that you will see, in this case from medicinal chemistry, gives you the idea that this is what we all hope for. We hope that we have a technology that matures into some kind of a proof of principle that ultimately ends up as some kind of a tool or a therapeutic at the end of the day. The question is, how do we get from there to there? Most of the people in this room are, of course, still very much concerned, and for good reason, with the exciting aspects of developing the products at an early stage. So this gives you, again, another overview of the kind of picture that we've been looking at. People challenged by developing assays, developing drugs that can be structurally characterized and ultimately may be turned into a lead or even clinical candidate. Now, the challenge, though, is that in doing that and in having a large group of people doing that, we can get focused on one end of the elephant. And so, in this case, you may be at this end of the elephant. But I guess what I'd like to do in this talk is remind you that the elephant has other parts, and that if we're going to get to patients, we're going to have sufficient education, not just on the side of the invention, but we have to have education on the side of the innovation. And so just bear with me for a few slides as I work through this concept that basically, and again, another typical slide, we see, and I apologize to those a little earlier. So if you look at funding investment, in the blue line is the funding by governments and universities. And I think it's pretty well established, it's no secret, that governments tend to like to support university research and academic research of a broader kind throughout this early innovation process, during which time we're developing our basic manufacturing or our proof of concept. On the other hand, companies are risk averse. They have to meet payroll. They have to take care of their stockholders. They can't have the luxury of failing. So they're going to look for a somewhat de-risked product later on, when they already have some understanding that this is going to be somewhat successful as a commercial product. And of course, in the middle, what's labeled there is GAP, which is not an acronym for a metabolic pathway or a drug, but it's really is a gap. It's called the Valley of Death. It's called the Great Divide. Is an area where we're really having a lot of difficulties. And so the question is, how do we bridge that gap? And this is a particularly, I think, important question for the people in this room. Because most of you are coming to the edge of the blue and looking with some fear at the yellow. And so the question is, what do you do if you're in a big room like the one we have outside, and one of the people that comes up to your poster is kind of interested in your technology as a commercial product. Maybe they come from a medium-sized to a large company. What they're going to do next is an exercise that we call due diligence. If they really think that you have something to offer, they're going to do a deep dive into you and your product and your lab and many other things to try to envision for themselves how this will fit into their portfolio. And what you're going to find is that in this process, they're going to draw together a group of people, and each one of those persons is going to look at a different part of the elephant. And that's their role. And so if you look at the people around that table, let's characterize what they're going to be thinking about. So the clinical affairs group, what do they care about? Well, they're going to be looking at your product, and the only thing they'll be thinking about is, where are we? Are we at IND or phase 0? Are we before IND? And what are my risks? But more than that, are there ways of accelerating my product? Can I use a compassionate use route? Can I develop it through a breakthrough therapy designation, which might cut 5 years off my path? And so they're going to be trying to look at your product and think about, what have you done and what have you not done that are going to prevent me from doing this efficiently? Then you're going to have the CMC person in the room. And the CMC person, the chemistry and manufacturing controls people, are going to be asking the question, how far along are we in our process development? Just as we heard earlier, have we characterized this product adequately? Do we know its quality critical attributes? Do we know its design attributes? And where are we in terms of the volume of materials that we will need for clinical trials and ultimately for commercialization? How hard is that scale-up process going to be? How expensive is the scale-up process going to be? And just how hard is this product going to be to manufacture? Of course, then you're going to have somebody from the IP side, and they're going to be looking at your product thinking, did you file a US provisional application? That's in the middle. Have you filed a full application? Is it any good? Have your IP people, often at the technology transfer section of your university, done a really good job? Is that patent bulletproof, or is it easily worked around? They're also going to wonder whether you filed under PCT, which in essence is a method that allows you within a year to file in many other countries. Because if you have a really good product, you're not just going to want to sell it in one constituency. And then, of course, you've got the regulatory people. Now, often I'm on the regulatory side, but regulatory is only one part. Getting product through the FDA is very good, but it's not the only thing. Ultimately, it's going to be just as hard to get it reimbursed. It's going to be very difficult to market that product in the face of competition. Nonetheless, the regulatory people are going to be pretty pushy at this stage, and they're going to be looking at the regulatory timelines, how quickly you're going to be able to get that into your first clinical trial, how quickly you're going to be getting it into the NDA. So they'll be looking at scrutinizing your product pretty carefully, trying to see if you're ready for the IND phase or whether there's just a huge amount of work yet to be done. And then, of course, you have the finance people at the table who are going to be trying to figure out how much is this product going to cost and how much. Every company has a portfolio. So if this product is going to be very, very expensive to develop, other products are not going to be able to be developed. So you're going to have the war of the champions going on. Different champions of different products trying to secure resources, and they're not necessarily going to look at you with enthusiasm. And these, I'm not going to tell you to memorize these, they're just examples, but they give you a suggestion of how they would break down and try to guesstimate how much your phase 1 studies are going to cost, how much your phase 2, phase 3. You can see phase 1 trials here are pretty much given a 0 compared to the very large costs that are involved in phase 3. Okay, so enough of that. But essentially where that leaves the inventor is kind of in a precarious situation. what often happens is the inventor doesn't see their own product through the eyes of all these other individuals. They still see it through their eyes of the developer. And that can make it difficult to communicate the value of the product, because perhaps some of the studies that could enhance the value of the product haven't been considered. So this is where I get to the education part, which I was invited to talk about. We're trying to educate students. We have a department of regulatory and clinical sciences at my university, and we have really 3 planks of education. First, we have starting to introduce some of this work into undergraduate studies. Not that we're going to produce experts, but so that people start thinking about it at a very early stage. We add it to courses that we have in pharmacy, in pharmacology, I have a course that's, medical products from idea to market. Then at the master's level, we spend a lot of time educating both people from industry and people who are newly minted that are going into the industry. And that's really important, because last week I advertised, I think, 14 jobs to our students on the website. We're doing that about every week. There are so many jobs open because there's been a real brain drain because of retirements of people who came through the system and basically owned it for so long. As those people retire, industry and academia has not done a good job of preparing another generation to fill those slots. So there is a lot of need. And then at the doctoral level, we have professional doctoral studies for people who are at mid-level management in industry, to bring them to the next level of being the next leaders. And that's sometimes a little more of a challenge than you might think. So at master's level, as I said, we've got training for industry, we've got training for new entrants, for crossover individuals coming from law or medicine. For our concurrently enrolled PhD students are now allowed in our school only to take a master's program for free with us. Otherwise, these are very expensive programs. And this year, we've started a new sort of a more leadership-oriented master's program for postdocs who have decided that at some point in their life, maybe they'd like to commercialize product. Okay. So I'm putting this up because I was talking to a colleague a couple of weeks ago who is at a senior level in one of the major drug companies, and he's doing a lot of the due diligence. And he said to me, I cringe when I hear I have an IND-ready product. He says, oftentimes the investigator just doesn't know what an IND-ready product is, and there's always some hole that is reached just in there that you've got to find. We are sensitive to this because as part of our department, we have a consulting center that gives free consulting for at least a short period of time to any faculty who walks in the door. And so we do see where the holes are. Similarly, you are lucky in Switzerland that you have an organization, I think it is called, that too, but this is not critical, something point nano, contact point nano, which is a new organization that for free offers services for people who are trying to transition. And there's a poster outside I saw, so I thought that was really great. But essentially, our investigators will often ask me questions. I don't really want to go back to school and learn to be a regulator, but what can I do to get a little bit closer to give industry at least some feeling of confidence that what I'm doing could be at some point ready for prime time. And so here are some just very simple hints. Complete and accurate lab notebooks, and maybe even standard operating procedures in the laboratories. I know you've all got perfect notebooks, but this is really important because they've got to take those notebooks and turn them, they've got to repurpose them into their product. Have some form of audit activity in your laboratory. Make sure that the data that's coming out is accurate and is of high integrity. Make sure that the calibration of the equipment is being carried out and that things are being labeled properly and that you're keeping inventory of how long you've had those supplies on the back shelf. And if you're getting into animal trials, really be careful. Get some guidance. For example, you could start capturing your data in ways that could be easily ported in. I talked earlier about send files. FDA is now very demanding that preclinical studies have all of their data in a certain medical terminology that is very specific for toxicology trials. And almost nobody is taught that at the academic level. So, but knowing at least a little bit about that might allow you to start collecting your data in a way that would be easily compatible with the industry, who's going to have to actually completely recode your data otherwise. Again, reproducibility. Equipment calibration is something that's fairly straightforward to do. Materials and chemicals, make sure you've got good specifications and information on your vendor selection. Laboratory training, I mean, not just in safety training, but in other forms of training. Training on how you wash glassware, how you label vials, how you deal with things like that. And finally, a good knowledge of IP protection and planning. And sometimes you may want to get more than one opinion on this. What you don't want is somebody to take hold of your intellectual property and hold it till 3 days before the patent is due and then say, oh, we're not going to support this anymore. You'll have to find somebody else and do it yourself. Strategic planning, I think, is also something that you can do. Even though you may not be planning to do all the animal trials that will be needed for the IND or the IDE, it's a good idea to figure out what they would be. There are lots of good guidance documents in these areas and lots of good standards, as we talked about earlier. And they're not very long, and it's worth to get acquainted with them because they give you a roadmap for the development of these products, at least at a basic level. Think about this when you're designing your methodologies. Think about the fact you're going to have to produce a lot of product. You're not going to be able to do just small amounts that are going to be injected into mice. So if you've got issues, you have to think about the robustness of your procedures and the scalability of those procedures. Even at this stage, it's worth thinking about sort of clinical manufacturing organizations, contract manufacturing organizations, contract research organization contracts to help you, because you're not going to be able to do manufacturing GMPs in your own laboratory. And packaging. Oftentimes people just don't think about packaging.
Francis, 1 minute.
Yes, of course, and I'm just about done. And so who are the competitors in this space, and how does your product differentiate? You really want to know what's special about your product so that you can give that elevator speech. So that's just a little bit of an overview and I think a bit of a wrap-up as we're thinking about product rather than we're thinking about invention. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'll allow a question for Francis, and then ask that all the speakers join me up front, and we will have about 15 minutes question and answer if people in the audience are interested and have additional questions. Any questions for Francis at this point? We have one.
Francis, thank you so much, first of all, for joining the first time CLINAM. Secondly, for providing such a really great overview for innovators. But perhaps also there, some of the resources that you just touched upon can be found either online and in terms of your coursework. Can you say a little bit about that?
Sure. More than one faculty member has taken our program and gone into industry, so I'm hesitant to talk too much about that at the university level, of course. But most faculty don't have that kind of time in their lives. But I've been amazed recently at what wonderful resources we have online. Some of the standards that you mentioned, the ISO standards, provide a roadmap. There's one, ISO 13014, that talks about the toxicology considerations for nanotech products. There are some good guidance documents in both EMA and here, and ISO has a very good, at least on the toxicology side, a pretty good companion document to what's called ISO 10993, which marches through what you need to do. And so it seems to me, if you were developing those products, looking at something that experts have put together in terms of what they think would be an optimum path would be a good place to start.
Thank you very much.